in January, after the war started in December, they brought over a regiment of National Guard from the West Coast, and they mixed up soldiers and National Guard and formed new outfits. And then we shipped out. The Americans was going south and occupying islands, and the Japanese was going south and east and occupying islands. And I went to Canton Island, and there was nothing there but a little airstrip. Now, they had commercial planes landing there and spending the night, and they had a little airstrip and one little building on the island. It had one palm tree on it and a large lagoon in the center of the island. So we set up anti-aircraft and sit there and waited and hoped they didn't come, which they didn't. And so the Air Force needed a control tower operator. I had a corporal that had experience in that. So I loaned him to the Air Force, and he was on the tower. And a dozen planes come in, C-47 cargo planes. And when they come in and landed, there was only 11 of them. One was missing. And there was also a Japanese task force out there. They were in 6 hours of sailing distance to us. And when that corporal got off duty that night and come in, he said he'd had a sad day because the aircraft kept calling in and asking for the beam to come in on. And he said the Air Force wouldn't let him put the beam out there because he was afraid the Japanese airplanes would come in on it. And he said they called him 3 or 4 times. And he said finally they called and told him we got 3 minutes worth of gasoline. Says, give me the beam or forget it. And he said he had no choice, he had to forget it. And that turned out to be the aircraft that, what was his name, that was lost so long?
Eddie Rickenbacker?
Yeah, Rickenbacker was on. And the next morning, those C-47s all took off. It was civilian pilots, ferry pilots, delivering the planes from the factory to General MacArthur on down further on. And then they sent old PBY Navy plane down there. It was amphibious. It'd land in the water, or they could run the wheels down and land on land. And it was searching for Rickenbacker. And it would fly all day long. And members of the crew, other than the pilot and his co-pilot and engineer, they'd be happy to stay home if somebody would take their place. So I volunteered to fly one day. And the sailor stayed at home. And so I was assigned the waist gunner. And I sit there with a machine gun sticking out of my tummy for 8 hours as that plane flew and looked down at the water. And water was all I seen until we come back in and landed. And I didn't volunteer for any more of that. But nevertheless, we stayed down there 6 months and went back up to Hawaii. However, while we was there, a Japanese submarine come down and entertained us for about a week. He'd come up at night and fire a few rounds and go back down. But he was firing over and hitting in the lagoon, and they wouldn't let us fire back at him. And he was on my side of the island, shooting in for 2 or 3 nights. And then he went around on the other side of the island and come up over there, and had brought 2 8-inch guns off the Lexington when it was sunk, and they'd set them up in cement there. And they'd brought in an old gray-headed sergeant in front of them, and the island commander, there was a lieutenant colonel, had done gone to bed, and he only lived about 50 yards from them big guns. And it was a moonshiny night, and that submarine come up about 1.5 miles out there, and this old sergeant could see the crew out on uncovering their gun, loading it, and the breeze was coming in. You could hear the guy in charge of the gun giving command. So boy, he got his crews out and he's loading up them 8-inch guns. And the colonel heard them breech blocks was flapping and carrying on. So he called the old sergeant, asked him what was the matter. And the sergeant told me, he says, I can blast that submarine out of the water with 1 shot. And he says, I'm going to get him. The colonel says, no, my orders is that we don't shoot. He told the colonel, if you don't want to hear these guns roar, you'd better get over here and get a hold of the lanyard. Because with them guns, they recoil so far back, they'd kill a man if they hit him. So they had like a rope tied to the trigger, and you'd stand back 6 or 8 foot and pull the rope to fire the gun, and that's what they called a lanyard. And in about 45 seconds, the colonel was over there barefooted and in his drawer tail a hold of the lanyard. So he didn't get to shoot at the submarine after all, but it only hung around a couple more nights till it left. And they was going to build a headquarters building for the Army on that island. And they was going to put it mostly underground. And I don't know how, but I got put in charge of that detail. And it was going to be a long building, about 200 foot long, and 1 story underground, 1 story above ground. And I was in charge of that detail until they decided not to do it. And they had a shipload of cement sitting out there tied up on the dock. And I was put in charge of unloading that ship. And I didn't know beans. I didn't even know how to open up a hole to get to the cement. And so I took my crew and got up on the back deck, and the ship's crew opened up the hatch. And I had a guy who knew how to operate the winches, so we went at it. We started unloading pallet loads of cement and setting them out on the dock. And we'd worked all day unloading the back end of the ship. And when I got off of it that night to go back for supper, I looked, and the back end of the ship is raised up out of the water, and the bow is still loaded with cement down. And the drive wheels, propeller wheels, was up in the air. And the guy couldn't move the ship, the captain could. And I understand that he come ashore the next day looking for me, but he didn't find me. And so the next day they got the bow end of it unloaded. got him leveled up. But he was afraid that a submarine would come in, you know, and he couldn't move and get out of the way. So I don't know whether he stayed aboard the ship that night or not. But that's the only ship I ever tried to unload.